Today's theme was set based on the current crisis we are facing, COVID-19 pandemic. And I have selected the paper that basically talks about observed and potential impacts of the COVID pandemic on the environment. Um, I think it is a little premature for us to get a better handle of this topic because the environmental impacts are long term and we have only been going through this pandemic for roughly 10 months. So this paper doesn't provide a lot of quantitative information about the nexus between COVID-19 pandemic and the environment, but it gives us a lot of things to think about. That is why I chose this uh, paper, because it sort of gives us some directions as well as the way forward as to how we should deal with our planet. So basically, the paper, the authors are, it's a multi-authored paper: Sheva, Ladamescu, Georgardis, Henniger, Pitikea, Leges. This is a combined team from Austria and USA. And the paper came up in International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health in April 2020. So basically, uh, if we look at uh, before getting into the paper, I would like to set up the background because right now we are facing this pandemic, which is basically a zoonotic disease, a disease that passed from animal to humans, even though the exact origin is still debated. Uh, I think eventually it will come out. So basically, these kind of diseases can be caused by a variety of pathogenic agents such as viruses, bacteria, fungi, other organisms, even prions. So these kinds of diseases can be transmitted from animals to humans in a variety of different ways. There can be direct transfer, as in the case of rabies, the number of animals who carries the rabies virus, and if you get bitten or scratched by them, there is a chance of the virus being transmitted from an animal to a human host. Then there are, of course, vector transmitted diseases such as malaria, bubonic plague, where vectors vary from diphtheria vectors to mites, which are the most common vectors we find in spreading of zoonotic diseases. It can also be transmitted through food, animal feces, urine, etc. What is most interesting is nearly 70% of the emerging infectious diseases falls into this category of zoonotic diseases. Now, when we say an emerging disease, it's a disease that appears for the first time in a certain population, like the pandemic we are facing today. All of a sudden, it appeared and started spreading throughout the world. Or emerging diseases can be considered as a disease that appear in one geographic area and starts appearing in another geographic area or in a new species. So, whatever said and done, what we see is during the last 50, 60 years, we have seen some tremendous growth of zoonotic diseases in the human population. Some of the notable diseases we have encountered during the last 50 years include Ebola, which first emerged in Congo and started spreading into a number of countries; Hendra virus, again emerged in Australia; avian flu; Nipah virus, SARS, MERS, and now we are stuck with COVID, which became a pandemic on 13th March, which was declared a pandemic on 13th March 2020. Now, what are the drivers behind such emerging zoonosis? Some of the main drivers include trafficking of animals. Even uh, when COVID came to be, it was assumed that the disease was transmitted to the human population by consuming bushmeat. So wildlife trafficking is the third largest, illegal wildlife trafficking is the third largest industry in the world. And it involves trafficking of animals, their body parts, or their meat to be consumed by people. And all of these things exposes us to various animal disease reservoirs. And although diseases are host specific, when humans are constantly exposed to these disease pathogens, there is a possibility of crossover from animal host to a human host. I think what we are seeing today is something like this. Uh, Crossover by a virus. Now, also, we create conditions as a outcome of development. We create situations where we promote vector populations. So a lot of these vector-borne diseases are a function of vector density. So if we create conditions that promote vectors, we also increase the possibility of vector-borne disease transmission. Also, another problem is increased spread of the whole species, because the way we are handling our affairs, we keep encroaching more and more into natural areas. A lot of natural areas contain a lot of species and their own pathogens, and the more we encroach into natural areas, we put ourselves closer to such disease reservoirs. So diseases can either spread from such wild reservoirs into humans directly or through vectors, or sometimes when we place our livestock very close to natural areas, the disease can spread from wild species to our livestock and from livestock to us. So the way we are uh, destroying the natural environment is putting us closer and closer to such zoonotic disease transmission. And also domestic species that we have, once again, when we get close to the wild environment, our domestic species may go into the wild and catch some of these diseases and bring it back to the human society. Loss of predatory species, human-induced genetic changes in disease vectors and pathogens, the overuse of pesticides, antibiotics have once again contributed to enhanced disease transmission. Poor land use planning, and also climate change driven changes in the distribution of vectors. We see some vector populations are increasing their distribution, and therefore people who were not exposed to certain diseases in the past are now becoming exposed to such diseases. So these kind of diseases are considered as a hazard that could eventually lead to a disaster situation. So according to IPCC, a disaster is an event that severely alters the functioning of a community due to a hazardous physical, biological, or human-related impacts, leading to widespread adverse effects on multiple environment, economic, and social processes. And if you look at COVID, it's a biological agent, coronavirus, which has now spread globally, creating global environmental, economic, and social disasters. So I think we can consider COVID-19 pandemic as a global disaster uh, generated by a biological organism. And these sort of disasters can be acute or chronic. Acute in the sense the disaster appears and disappears within short span of time, like a landslide or tsunami, whereas some disasters are chronic, like HIV has persisted in the human population for nearly 4 decades now. And likewise, we do not know how long we will have to deal with this current pandemic. So basically, pandemics greatly increase morbidity as well as mortality over a wide geographic area, and will have significant social, economic, and political impacts uh, on how we do things. So also, when such a pandemic occurs, we try to respond to that, and that response in turn can have serious socio-ecological implications to the planet, which is something I will touch upon towards the end of my presentation. So basically, this paper that I have selected presents an overview of potential consequences of COVID-19 on natural and anthropogenic environments. Um, And I think it's very early to, like I said, to talk about this, but still, I think this is something that we should be thinking about. And also, this opens up multiple areas for us to engage in research. Now, the methodological approach they have followed is they have basically captured information from various sources, peer-reviewed publications, press releases by international organizations, etc. So they have basically looked at 142 references, and you can see these references come in the form of blogs, books, book chapters, mainly peer-reviewed articles, reports, websites, and also personal communication. So if you look at basically according to what this paper has presented, what are the impacts of COVID-19 on the environment? So this can be looked upon from variety of different facets. But what we have to understand is the virus itself does not have a direct effect on the environment other than the impact it is having in the human uh, species. However, most of the impacts, positive, both positive and negative, has arisen due to how we try to respond to the virus or the disease. So these impacts can be divided into three major categories. Immediate impacts, impacts that have been observed within weeks after the breakout of the pandemic. Medium-term impacts, impacts that have taken place over months, and of course long-term impacts, uh, which may run for years, especially impacts that may be generated in the post-COVID era, are something that we have to be mindful. So these impacts can be both positive and negative. So let me walk you through some of the impacts that have been described in this paper. Uh, Short-term impacts, the negative impacts have arisen from how we respond to these diseases. Because you would notice that our way of life has changed. We follow certain conditions, the health directives, which requires all of us to wear face masks, sanitize ourselves, maintain distances, and also most countries have gone through long lockdown periods, which has had serious implications on the psychology of people and so on. So the one of the negative impacts that arises is due to the waste produced in our attempt to respond to this disease. If you look at the amount of face masks or the waste generated due to face masks is tremendous. There's 7.2 billion people on this planet. Even if 50% of them are using face masks on a daily basis, you can imagine the number of uh, waste we will be producing um, throughout this pandemic. So we have already lived through 10 months of it, and we don't know how much longer that we will have to maintain this. And we also saw all kinds of things, inventions coming up. There was a invention where we try to have a alcohol spraying system, and luckily this has been terminated because sometimes we try to overdo in our response. And what is the impact of these responses on the planet is something that we have not thought about in our hurry to deal with the disease. And also, this disease has imposed various travel restrictions, which has prevented the farmers or fishermen from transporting their goods, exporting, or even local transportation systems have completely become disrupted for a short period of time. And as a result, we have generated large quantities of organic waste, vegetables, and fish that were destroyed because they could not sell them. And it is in two ways wasteful. One is if you catch a fish and if you can't sell it, that is a waste. And also you're generating large quantities of organic waste, which starts disintegrating, can also create environmental problem. The positive impacts, uh, short-term positive impacts, again, come due to travel restrictions. because most countries have tried to introduce travel restrictions. We have gone to lockdowns for several months. Some countries are still in lockdowns. In Sri Lanka, we have tried it for a few months. Now we are going for regional lockdowns or local lockdowns. But what this does is it decreases human mobility, as well as it also decreases industrial and economic activities of people. What this map shows is the reduction in mobility across the world. The gray areas are areas where there is no data, but uh, these other colored areas indicate various levels of reduction. And you can see the entire North America sees roughly 20 to 30% reduction in their mobility. And Brazil, same thing, Australia. And also when you look at Europe and these uh, uh, South American countries, the reduction has been as high as 70%. And if you look at our own area, South Asia and East Asia, and also the southernmost part of South America, you can see the reduction is somewhere around 40 to 50%. So this is a tremendous reduction in mobility. And also the air traffic movement uh, came down due to this, because the pandemic, to prevent the spread of pandemic, the movement of people across the globe has come to almost a standstill. There has been a 63% decline in commercial and trade flights. You can see in this diagram how the average has dropped during the early part of the pandemic in March and April. Now, aviation sector is one of the most polluting sectors, which contributes about 1 to 2% of the global greenhouse gas emissions and 3 to 5% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. So in that sense, this has been positive because there is a significant reduction in GHG and CO2 emissions due to this reduction in air traffic. But at the same time, what you see is when planes travel, it produces what are referred to as contrails. So when you reduce the air traffic, the contrails also decrease. Now, contrails also have a part to play in our climate, because the contrails are basically water vapor driven systems which can reflect heat waves back onto the planet. So when the contrails are there, the change in the day and night temperatures is much less, because at night there is no radiation coming from the sun, but the area that is under darkness loses heat waves. But if there are contrails, they will reflect it back. But when you cut down on the air traffic, the contrails begins to disappear, and therefore more heat is lost into the atmosphere, resulting in very wide day and night temperature variation. So also a reduction in greenhouse gases has resulted in overall reduction in the global temperature on a short-term basis, and also a reduction in the air temperature. Also, what we have to recognize is that these planes are fitted with various weather monitoring systems. So when a plane travels, it not only transport people and goods, it's also collecting data about global weather, which is then fed into various models to predict weather changes and also forecasting weather. So there has been roughly about a 65% reduction in data collection, which has severely hampered the weather predictions for the planet during this time. So there were positives and there were also negatives due to this reduction in mobility. And also, lockdowns have had a global impact on air, urban air. There is a significant reduction in nitrogen dioxide, carbon dioxide, and particulate matter levels. Also, a reduction in mobility has also reduction in tire wear, which contributes to fair significant amount of pollution, and also water quality, pollution loads. All these things have seen a short-term reduction in the planet. Here, what you can see is both NASA and ESA monitor pollution through satellites, and these are two satellite images showing the nitrogen dioxide levels in the northeastern China. So this is Beijing, this is Wuhan. Uh, somewhere here is Shanghai and so on, some of the major cities of China, where there is very heavy use of motor traffic and also industrial facilities. And all of these emit nitrogen dioxide into the air. So around 23rd January, Wuhan was locked down, and then the lockdown spread into other major cities of China. And you can see the result here. You can see this uh, yellow color. You can see the legend down here, which shows the tropospheric nitrogen density. So dark brown indicates a very high density, white indicates a very low density. And you can see this area, especially Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, all these major cities have very high levels of nitrogen dioxide in their atmosphere. Subsequent to the lockdown, within about 2 weeks, you can see this nitrogen dioxide has come to almost a very, very low level, which shows that again shows the impact that we are having on the planet's atmosphere. Here is another data set that was generated by satellites. This is monitoring the aerosol levels. What you see here is the aerosol levels in northern India. Aerosols refers to the total liquid and particles suspended in the atmosphere. And how you should interpret this is optical thickness of less than zero point 0.1, that is somewhere around here, indicates very clear skies, and optical thickness of 1, which is more towards the dark brown area, indicates very hazy conditions. And generally, aerosols are linked to agricultural activities where land is cleared and then the biological material are burned in preparation of fields for sowing the seeds. Also, forest fires can also generate lots of aerosols. So, if you look at northern India, there is a lot of farmers in this region, and generally from March to June is the period where they prepare their lands for farming. And you can see from 2016, 2017, you can see a time series here. These are all taken towards the first 2 weeks of April. You can see in 26 compared to 2016, 2017 has much higher aerosol levels. 18 has even more. 19 somewhat reduction, but 2020 April, you can see the sky is entirely clear, which is indicative of a significant drop because of the COVID pandemic. The agricultural activities in India came to a standstill, and the result is a significant reduction in aerosol levels in the short run. And when we talk about water quality, what has been observed or recorded is an overall reduction in water usage and a significant reduction in industrial water use, because industry uses a lot of water for cooling purposes, etc. And since most of the industrial activities came to a standstill, overall water usage in the planet went down. Also in touristic areas, what you see here is Venice, one of the most attractive tourist destinations in the world. And what you see here are two photographs. You may have seen this even before, comparing Venice in April 2019, that is before the pandemic, and after April 2019. Venice is a city of boats. It's a very attractive city for tourists. Millions of tourists visits here, and you can see if you look at this lower picture, all these little white specks indicate boats. So this is the main canal running through uh, Venice, and then there are also sub canals which are used by tourists for boating. And this is Murano, the famous island for glass blowing. So there is heavy traffic between Venice and Murano. You can see all these little boats heading to and from Murano. And after the pandemic, you can see Venice has been completely locked down and hardly any boats. Uh, the water transport has come to a standstill, and therefore perturbation of the water has also come down. You can see how large areas are clearing up from these satellite images. Areas that were very hazy in this picture started clearing up So the water became very clear, the conditions became much better. But these are all short-term effects that has arisen due to the COVID pandemic. Then the impact on ecological systems. So again, I think this pandemic raised awareness about the need to curtail illegal trade. In fact, in China, they have put a ban on consumption of bushmeat. I don't know how effective it is, but again, I think this pandemic made us rethink the way we treat nature, about habitat destruction, about illegal trade of animals and plants. So this is a positive thing that is coming out of it if we can sustain this in the long run. But at the same time, the pandemic has put great deal of constraint on ecological research. Those of us who work on ecology, our laboratories out there. But if we can't travel, it puts great amount of restriction in what we can do. So during the last 10 months, if you look at the number of publications coming out in ecology, you can see a significant reduction. Also, uh, some ecological systems, there has been a short-term positive impact, especially national parks and so on, because the visitation has come to a near standstill. Many of the national parks in Sri Lanka were closed, which means they have not be receiving visitors. So one of the bigger issues in national park is over visitation, which puts enormous amount of pressure on wild species. So for a short period of time, this pressure has been removed. Illegal natural resource extraction has declined during this period, once again due to the travel restrictions and bans imposed upon people. However, what is the long-term impact on ecological systems is yet to be uh, discovered, because it will depend on how countries will pursue their economic activities in the post COVID era. Because at the moment, most countries are facing serious economic setbacks due to the disruption of their main industries. Like if you take Sri Lanka, the tourism industry has come to near standstill. Um, our foreign labor uh, or income generated by foreign labor has come to a very, very low level. Our industrial system has almost come to a standstill. So we are facing serious economic setback, and how governments, likewise, I think all countries are facing similar problem, and how governments will try to overcome this. What is the path they will take will again define how ecological systems will be affected in the long run. But what we have to keep in mind is, if we try to recover our economy at the expense of nature, once again we make ourselves even more vulnerable for future pandemic situations. And then environmental monitoring and climate. Like I've indicated earlier, a lot of environmental monitoring activities have been hampered due to this lack of mobility, the data collection for climate modeling and climate forecasting have been seriously impacted during the early part of the pandemic due to lack of data coming in. But then, if you look at climate, how coronavirus would influence the climate, there are two aspects. One is how the climate will influence the disease transmission. There's a lot of research going on. There are certain trends that have been observed, that especially people in tropical countries are less susceptible, or the disease spread in tropical countries are much less compared to temperate countries. So that they are trying to find a nexus between climate and disease transmission. However, there are no clear correlates coming out yet, because there are a number of other confounding variables in it, not only climate, population density. There are a number of things that controls disease transmission. So we will have to tease out these things in future. So this is an area where I think uh, more research is required. But on the other hand, we have how would the disease impact economic policies taken to offset climate change impacts. So there are a number of governments, there are a number of conventions. The governments have come up with various economic policies to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions. But in the aftermath of this pandemic, uh, how would governments try to respond, and how would these responses by the government will impact the economic policies taken to offset climate change? Again, only time will tell us. But what we can see is the short-term effects on the climate has been positive. However, the long-term effects will depend on, once again, how governments will respond to the economic crisis created by the pandemic in the post-COVID era. So the question arises, where do we go from here? Because if you look at our planet, there are lots of indications that we have pushed the planet beyond its limits, especially when it comes to loss of species, uh, climate, nitrogen dioxide levels. So, in number of areas, we have pushed the planet beyond its ability to cope. So, over the last 40, 50 years, we have slowly pushed the planet towards a fairly unstable stage because of human activities. And that's why in 2017, United Nations came up with the Sustainable Development Goals, trying to bring back some stability to the planet. So it is in this backdrop that we were hit by the pandemic. So pandemic resulted in some short-term positive results, but again, when the lockdowns were lifted, again the pollution levels increase, again lockdown. So basically we are going through a fluctuating situation here, uh, positives followed by negatives. So uh, and also the waste issues and so on. So we are somewhere in this region right now. The question is what lies ahead. And this paper proposes three scenarios. I guess these are the only three scenarios anybody can think of, because one scenario is that we will understand uh, our impact on the planet. Because I think when I selected this paper, it was not a great paper, but I think it did summarize a lot of very important information. One is, we all knew that we are having a significant impact on the planet, but what is that impact can only be determined empirically by stopping our activity, which was not possible because nobody was going to shut down the world for no reason. But the pandemic forced us to shut down. And the results are very clear. We can see that the atmosphere recovering, the water systems are recovering. So what it tells us is that if we understand our impact on the planet, and if we try to change the way we do things, we have the opportunity to recover the planet, to come down, have a better future for this planet, which is the scenario one. Or we can continue as we are doing right now, the business as usual model, where things will continue to go down. Or the third scenario is the most scary one. In trying to catch up with the economic losses, we can increase the resource utilization, we can increase our processes uh, in trying to jack up the economic setback, in which case we will push the planet into even more disastrous or more vulnerable situation. Because if you look at the last major pandemic we have, the world has experienced, was the Spanish flu in 1980, which took place in 1918 and 1919. Around 500 million people were infected, 50 million people died. So at that time, 500 million is about one third of the world population. COVID 19 thus far, based on the latest information, has affected 102 million people and resulted in 2.2 million deaths worldwide so far. So, compared to Spanish flu, we have this pandemic is not as uh, is not causing as mortality or infections as Spanish flu had, because compared to 1918, our population has almost increased by 3 or 4 folds. So, if you look at as a percentage, fewer people are affected, fewer percentage of people have succumbed to this pandemic. But we can be assured that even with the technological advances and the medical advances we are having, this pandemic has taught us that we are incapable of dealing with a pandemic of this nature. And these kind of pandemics are likely to affect us more because one, our population has increased and continue to increase, and higher the density, higher the probability of disease transmission. Then there's rapid globalization, unlike in 1918, 1919, there is a lot of travel, which is again another pathway to quickly transmit a disease across the globe. So, global level transmission becomes even more obvious with rapid globalization that we see on the planet. And then, thirdly, we see compared to 1918, there is a huge amount of environmental degradation, which increases the vulnerability to zoonotic diseases. So I think if we have learned anything from this pandemic, I think what we have to do is we have to start thinking about this scenario one, whether we can change the way we do things, whether we can reduce our footprint on the planet so that we will make a more resilient planet. And also, when it comes to health, we have to start seriously thinking about the One Health approach, because we are only thinking of human health at the moment, but we have to understand that the human health significantly depends upon environmental health and animal health. By only by considering these three things together, which is what is called the One Health model, we can think of how to be resilient against such future pandemics. So this is basically what the paper was about. And I think if you want to ask any clarifications, questions, uh, we can have a discussion about some of the things, because I think this paper has given us great deal of food for thought as to how we should proceed in the post-pandemic era. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Devaka sir, for your very interesting presentation. I have a question which is not directly related to environment and the pandemic. Um, do you think, Devaka sir, the lockdowns have helped reduce social issues such as violence, crimes, road traffic accidents due to reduced mobility of the people?
I think the results are rather mixed. I read a few papers regarding this. Some research has indicated that even though violence uh, on a broader scale has declined, lockdown has resulted in a lot of domestic violence, because and also a lot of psychological issues people. But I think again we've had only 10 months. Most of the publications are only coming out now. I think it's a mixed bag of results. Even with the environment, there were positives and negatives. I think likewise for the socially, I think the bigger social issues have been loss of jobs. I think there's some serious social issues popping out due to this COVID. Many people have lost their jobs. If you take the tourism sector, like chauffeur drivers, guides, all of these people are finding it extremely difficult to live. So I think some of the impacts of these social effects might come later on. So I think only time will tell us.
Thank you for initiating this. It's really, really good work. So you mentioned in the, especially as a short-term positive impact, so illegal natural resources extraction has declined. So I feel it's the other way around, sir. For example, like land grabbing and poaching, especially in remote areas like the place where I live. So because most of the people during the lockdown period from the towns, they have come to their original villages. So because of that, I feel that sort of activities have increases in the remote areas, especially. So what do you think about that, sir?
No, I think at a micro level, those things were expected. But I think when I said the impact on the natural resources has declined in the sense global wildlife trafficking, all these things have shown a decline during this period because of the restrictions imposed upon exportation and so on. But that is only a very short term effect. And most of these kind of short term effects are likely to be followed by a rapid increase in natural resource use because I think that's why I said in the long term effect is what we have to be aware of because this has pushed more people into poverty. Poverty is one of the biggest issues for increased use of natural resources in the remote areas. So I think if we do not manage that, it's going to be a disastrous situation. But in what I only indicated in the short run, during the early period of pandemic, there has been a decline in the pressures on natural systems. But most likely, it is going to be the other way around in the long run. We already see that our own government is trying to uh, revoke the gazette notification that controls residual forests. So all these things, I think, will indicate are giving indications that it's going to be a turbulent future. And also, like the three scenarios I presented, ideally, we should go for scenario one, but what history teaches us, we have gone through disasters like the tsunami, 30-year, three decade long war. After each of this, we had the opportunity to take scenario one. But what history teaches us is we have gone for scenario three. So I remain skeptical. Uh, what will happen even after pandemic is going to be scenario three, which is going to be a disastrous for the planet. Unfortunately, but I hope I'm being proved wrong on this prediction.
Thank you, sir. So I feel the same. So we'll be adapting the scenario three, I guess, after like everything comes down to a normal situation. So like you mentioned, clearly, like, the government is, I'm not, biased to any government or any political party, but I'm like, and I have seen, I'm seeing right now also, like, what the government is doing. So unfortunately, I think we all are in a hopeless situation, right, sir?
Um, well, it depends. I guess this is what we have to work towards as conservation biologists. We have to constantly advocate not to do that and use whatever uh, sources available to bring adequate pressure on governments to not to pursue that path because that path will only lead us to destruction. um, I hope sanity will remain to some extent. I know a lot of people are fighting this the new residual forest issue on various forums. So I hope maybe before it's too late, whether we can convince the government that maybe we have to rethink how we should uh, deal with our economic crisis. So far, I don't see any positive signs. But there is no reason to lose hope. We always live in hope, Chandima.
Yes, sir. Yeah, okay. Thank you, sir.
Sir, can I ask a question? Uh,
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for your insight, sir, and also for your presentation. Just to ask you now, as you very rightly pointed out, if you take, for example, management of protected areas, um, just taking one example of visitation, there would have been very good opportunity for studies to be done on the lack of visitation on protected areas, but unfortunately during the pandemic time we can't. But now as soon as restrictions are lifted, we might miss out on that opportunity. For example, even to take a policy decision, to have concrete evidence to show that you must restrict visitation. That is only just one example,
Yes.
because all these particularly impacts on parks may be very temporary. So, is there any long-term thing that we could possibly to see the benefits of the lack of any human actions on these parks? Because once we get back to normal, all these things will get adjusted again. So we would have missed a huge opportunity to have to get some concrete evidence for the impact, for such impacts.
I'm afraid we missed that window, Maria, because it only presented a very small, narrow window to record, collect empirical
Exactly.
data.
Mm.
Yeah. And the wildlife department, even though we've approached the wildlife department, they wouldn't even let us go in
Oh,
to make some observations. So this is an ongoing battle we've always had with the officials. Uh, Lack of vision in terms of what needs to be done. Uh,
yeah.
with
Even
overlook,
proof, even to collect proof of,
yeah,
that should be
lack of
managing
visibility.
certain things. Yes. So,
That's a
so
sad thing, but I think over visitation issue is something that we've been trying to address for a long time, because what we see is we are not utilizing our national parks optimally. If you look at the visitation numbers, Yala, Udawalawa, Horton Plains, and Min area has a highly in proportionate number of visitations, whereas similar parks or parks which have even better wildlife viewing experiences attract very few people. So I think this is something that we have to be working with the tourist industry and the wildlife department to try to distribute the tourism among the 25 or so parks we have. It's an ongoing discussion, and I hope we will make some inroads in the future. This is the only thing I can think of at this moment.
thank you, sir.
Devaka Preeti here. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And I just want to raise a point and then ask for your opinion on another matter. And it just struck me that there is a lot of plastic pollution because of this situation. Because if you take labs, the health sector, I mean, all the disposables, like all the, even a PCR tube is plastic. And so there must be masses of plastic waste that is being disposed. It just struck me right now, seated here and listening to you. So in the long run, that will be a problem, I guess. The second point I want to pick your brains on is, Devaka, now it's about the balance of the what can I say, ecological health or the environment health versus the economic crisis that the world over that we are facing. So in that sense, what do you think about opening up? I'm not trying to be political here, but like, what do you think about the balancing of things, like gradually seeping into natural, like our normal way of life, like schools reopening and then the airports being open, tourism coming in, and because some people feel very very strongly about this. What do you feel about it?
Um, I think any this sort of pandemic, basically a virus is a unique organism. It is something that we refer to as life on the edge because it cannot survive on its own. So it's a super parasite. So what we see now from evolutionary point of view, what I see is any virus would try to do is when it affects a host, it will go through this high mortality stage, but it should evolve into a form that can persist in the host without killing the host. Because otherwise, evolutionary, it is at a disadvantage. If it kills the host, it kills itself. So I think given time, the virus will come to an equilibrium. I don't know, like Spanish flu disappeared on its own, but this virus will also, at some point of time, is going to mutate into a morph that might live in the society like influenza. I'm sure when influenza came, it would have been like this. We don't have any records because at that time the documentation was not so good and the medical system was not developed. So, from evolutionary point of view, we will have to learn to live with this disease because the longer we remain shut down, the longer we try to avoid getting the disease, we push ourselves deeper and deeper into an economic crisis. So it is inevitable we have to open up. But the question is, this kind of disaster requires novel thinking, new ways of doing things. Because even if you look at our responses to one of the issues is food security, because this kind of disaster teaches us that we have to rethink about our supply lines. We have to rethink about our economic process. How do we deal with it? But I think, unfortunately, I don't see that kind of visionary thinking in those who are taking decisions. And again, regarding this, the medical waste, this is hazardous, and also it is we are sometimes going for overkill. I mean, the other day I went to the hospital and I was just observing the doctor within about 5 minutes changed gloves like 10 times. So we're generating so much. We have to be mindful that in trying to, because I have always seen in the post disaster situations after tsunami, we saw this, our response to the disaster creates a much bigger disaster because we only think of responding to the disaster. We do not think about the lateral damage we are causing. So I think perhaps it is our duty to start a dialogue among the society that our response, we have to be mindful of how our response will uh, push the planet even to a further disequilibrium by trying to overdo things. But it's going to be a long road, Pritya. I think we'll have to do a lot if we have to uh, educate the masses as to the potential that, uh, that lies in our response to the disease.
Thank you, Dev.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yes,
It's not a
India.
question, just your view on this. Now, as you said, sir, there have been a lot of fluctuation, like rapid fluctuations of the condition of the environment due to these lockdowns and reopening and like that. What do you think, like how the biodiversity will be affected by this? Like, because there could be some species that are kind of adapted to adverse conditions, and anyway, like their conditions are changing all the time. So, how do you think that would affect them?
I my worry is that the biodiversity will be adversely affected in this country because I think the current thinking is to expand to respond to this by expanding our agriculture, which will mean that we are going to lose. We're already losing 7,000 hectares of natural areas annually, but in the post-COVID era, this number is likely to increase significantly, and that will lead to more human-wildlife conflicts, which means and most of the conflict-causing species are threatened or endemic species, and also more habitat loss and more habitat fragmentation. So I think at the moment, if we do not understand our situation and take a very planned approach to respond to the economic crisis, I think we are going to be losing more species in the next few years in what we in how we try to respond to this situation. That is my take at the moment. Again, I'm hoping that sanity will prevail and we will start rethinking how we are going to recover, because biodiversity, agriculture is a necessity, but we can change the way we do our agriculture. Uh, it can be done in a way that is not as destructive as it is, but I don't see that thinking or the policies being developed along those lines. But we are going to keep on increasing the area under agriculture, which is not going to help in the long run, because there are other industries like tourism, which heavily depends on biodiversity. These are the resources that we use to attract tourism. So on one side, we might increase our agriculture, but we will be losing out on many other areas. So I think this is why it is extremely necessary for us to rethink how we are going to deal with this pandemic, or how we are going to respond to it, and how we are going to come out of this economic crunch without sacrificing our very important natural resources. So this is a dialogue I think has to start now, and a dialogue that we have to contribute as academics tremendously to help out the government to take the right decisions.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Hello, Professor. Can I ask a question?
Yes, Ashoka.
Uh, Thank you for like very nice discussion and initiating this journal club. This is, I think, very useful for us in the future. So my concern is about this paper, Professor. So most of the information they have gathered from mainly like most of online sources, especially from blogs, etc., like which may have lots of personal perspectives. So, what do you think about the reliability of those information, and when it comes to research work, do you think they have uh, shown us some reliable data?
Yeah, I think the satellite data are fairly robust
Yeah,
because
exactly. Yeah,
the
that's
technology has been there for a long time for the remote sensing data.
mm,
Um, Other things, of course, I think there has very little quantitative assessments, because, like I said, the pandemic has been with us only for 10 months, and it's not enough for us to reach any concrete conclusions. And even data collection has been hampered due to travel restrictions and so on. So, most of the information that this paper has relied on are secondary sources based on lot of remote data collection techniques. But I think in the next few months, we are going to see more robust data sets. And there are huge data sets. That's the other issue, to analyze trends and so on. Uh, there will be we will require large analytical platforms to process such big data sets. But I think we'll get a better handle of things maybe within the next year or so. This paper is very premature. That's why I said at the very outset that the information provided are very scanty, and the analysis is more towards predictive rather than conclusive. Uh, I think we'll have to wait a little longer to really come up with some conclusive empirical data sets to really understand what does the pandemic hold for the planet.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
So can I add a little bit?
Yes, Chandima.
Adding to Ashoka's and Myra Madam's concerns, so you mentioned we missed the window for starting research the effects of COVID. So, like, can't we do something like as a team from the uni scientists to reach out the wildlife department to start at least to monitoring research? For example, like, maybe you have noticed like after some times I went to Vaskamo National Parks like that was in January, like to monitor all the elephants that I used to monitor. So I found some family groups, they have become very aggressive. The reason is they did not see people like for some times, right? So likewise I
Yeah.
see some sort of behavioral changes of these animals as well. This is a very very normal little example, but this couldn't be the norm for all the animals. But my point is like because you are in a position to influence the research committee and along with other researchers in the university. Can't we do something like to initiate some sort of monitoring work?
I guess we can try to do that. And also, what we'll have to be thinking about is I remember when the tsunami came, one of the main conclusions people reached was that animals responded to tsunami by running away. But Dr. Fernando had a collared elephant in Yala right next to the beach, which was tracked through satellite, which indicate that that didn't happen with this elephant. But of course, somebody can argue the sample size is one. But I think maybe there might things like this which we can think of in retrospect. Some of the colored animals we've had, how their behavior changed. Even though we missed the window, we might be able to think back and think of ways to recapture some of these behavior data. I know a lot of people have camera traps in the system, collared animals, and so on. So maybe it's interesting for us to go back and look at their behaviors in retrospect during the lockdown period to see whether we see any significant changes from the norm. That is one thing. And like you said, I think maybe when it's still not too late for us to start looking at this. We can even start using proxies. Uh, Even though we missed the window when something like this happened, the other option would be to try and use some proxies to compare behaviors and see what is happening in less visited places versus over visited places and so on. So I think even this kind of anecdotal observations people have made, I think it's worthwhile for us to have a relook at it and see whether we can make some sense out of the way animals have responded during the lockdown period. So I think one thing we can do is maybe we can initiate some kind of a group, or we can write to all the researchers who have been working around to see whether they have access to such data, and maybe try to bring this data together and make an analysis and see whether we can make out some uh, changes in their behavior. That is also another option we have, but we'll have to start establishing some kind of a group to discuss this.
Yes, I think because wildlife department already have some elephants with collar, which we were trying to get the data. So
Yeah.
I think that's a very good data set if you can, push them to get that data set and see the patterns of animal. I'm not sure whether we'll see any pattern, but there could be some changes of movement due to lack of human activities in some areas. So we'll see whether we can get
Yeah.
nature.
CCR has some data sets, so I think, and they have a long-term baseline. So maybe we can see whether there has been a significant change in their ranging patterns or uh, movement patterns during the lockdown period. I think it's still possible for us to go and ask some uh, good questions about what happened.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sir, I'm Thanusha here. No, as Dr. Vindhya pointed out now, since we are observing like continuous fluctuations of this pollution and all those aerosols, particles, and the carbon dioxide levels, so there could be like really sensitive organisms like plant and animal species which are very sensitive to these environmental factors, right? Rather than habitat loss and all, because like when we consider all these aerosol particles changing, like because since they don't have time for any adaptations because due to these fluctuations. So at the moment, like do we have any specific data like in Sri Lanka with these animals, like rather than the separate studies which has been done, like considering a list like animals and plant species like which are very sensitive to these environmental like fluctuations, so therefore like we can monitor what like which could be most vulnerable during this COVID era. So then we can like I make awareness in the government and with the people. Like, are there any particular studies which has been done like regarding this biota?
Um, Not that I'm aware of, but I think one of groups of organisms that we could have focused was lichens, because
Yes,
they're very sensitive
yes, like
to environmental pollutants.
yeah,
If we could have seen whether during, I don't know whether the window is long enough for lichens to expand
yeah,
in urban areas,
yeah,
but it might be one thing that we can, looking at indicator species like that, to
yes,
see whether there has been a fluctuation in their densities.
yeah,
Uh, Maybe even still is not too late, because even though we are coming back to some normalcy, I can see that the vehicular traffic is still at a very low level. So I think if we just select a few urban locations and start monitoring
yeah,
lichen populations, we might be able to pick out something like that.
yeah,
But to answer your question, I'm not aware that anybody has done so. I think that is also one of the main outcomes of a journal club like this, because it gives us new research ideas to
mm,
go and start looking at new things. So I think this is something maybe we can immediately start, because the window has not closed on us yet.
yes,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes,
yes, sir. Thank you very much.
So can I raise a question?
yes, Priyanka.
Yeah, so thank you for the nice presentation. That the question I have is that you mentioned about aviation thing as well. So during this COVID-19, that it is highly obvious that we should not use public transportation. But before this COVID-19 thing, actually it was encouraged to use public transportation because it reduces the carbon footprint and the air pollution and everything. But after this COVID-19 thing, it has become really obvious that we should as much as possible we should avoid public transportation, that we should merely use personal transportation. But with this I think it's a bit ironic that does is it an negative impact of COVID-19, or how can we balance this, that not everyone can afford their personal transportation as well? So with COVID-19, how can do you have any idea how can we work on this?
Um, Yeah, I think you raised a very pertinent question, because at the moment, I think still people are not fully functional. But my worry is after, uh, or when we reopen, there's going to be more vehicular traffic on the road, because people, for the very reason that you mentioned, because on one side there is law which says you can only carry certain number of passengers, which means either we'll have to increase the number of buses or people will have to use their. So this is again going to be a negative impact, like the face mask and so on. The response that we have for COVID is going to be negatively impacting the environment, because we will see that there is a spike of increase after as we return to normalcy. But I think it is also important we take a lot of these rules at their face value. Perhaps we should try and see whether these restrictions have reduced but nobody's doing the correlation studies to see whether reduction in the use of public transportation has actually contributed to the reduction in the disease transmission. We just accept that we have to do this, but if that is not effective, then perhaps we can you know uh, say that that is not required, because that is again shows the importance of research uh, to really test, because these are all hypotheses at the moment, uh, that this distancing and all that, whether these things are really helping to reduce the transmission of the disease. If not, we are just adding an additional burden on the planet without getting any progressive results. So this is another area where I think we can do a little piece of research to see whether uh, this limited number of people in the public transportation, or whether using the buses have, but again I think you'll have to do a trace study of people who got affected, how many of them have used public transport, how many of them have used private transport, and whether we see a significant difference in the number of people who got infected by using public transport. So this is the kind of research I think we'll have to generate, and then only based on the evidence that is presented, we can see whether we should persist with these policies or whether we can change the policies in a manner that is more environmentally friendly.
Yes, thank you so much.
I would like to kind of formally thank Devaka sir so much. So thank you very much for this very informative presentation, and also on a very timely topic. So thank you so much, Professor Devaka Weerakoon,
You're
sir.
welcome. Yeah, thank you.
And thank you all others for participation and also asking questions and joining in the discussion.